Okay, this week we're finishing chapter 10, about classes. So there's some useful things for us to look at here. There's the display 10.5, the bank account class. Has some interesting things, some interesting features to look at. You'll notice they've overloaded some member functions in there, and whenever they use a function with a stream parameter in order to replace it with either a system input or output stream or a file input or output stream. They've got an example of that. So that would be the output function. And that would, of course, be the output example. You can do the same thing for input, which will be useful for your assignment this week. They also cover constructors and using constructors for the initialization of data for a class, for an object. So let's take a look at display 10.6. You'll see they've got 3 constructors, including a default constructor that takes no parameters. That's the one that gets used when you just declare a variable of the main type without giving it any parameters. Constructors can be useful for initializing things that you may need for a valid example of a particular type. They also talk about abstract data types again, ADT, and again, this is a way to make an object that the programmer using the object does not have to know very much about your class in order to be able to use. Certainly they don't need to know the internals of how the code works in your object, and that would be the implementation. All they need is the interface, which is the public parts of your class, the accessors, mutators, and the comments that go along with your public functions in order to be able to use those. And ideally, you would be able to change your class without that user having to change their program at all. If you added new features, they would be able to use those by adding those to their program, but their existing program would continue to work just by compiling. You would get your new object and so forth. 10.7 shows you how they have changed the implementation of the bank account class in such a way that the interface doesn't change at all. And even though they have made some significant changes to how it works, including how the data is stored internally, a program using that class would not have to be altered. It would just have to be recompiled. Then they talk about inheritance and derived classes, parent and children, data types, and so that's some information that you should be aware of. Your project for this week will be project number 1 in chapter 10. It's a grading program. If you look on the online classroom, you'll see that for our version in class, I want you to do both options. It says it can either be done with input from the keyboard, input and output directly to the user, so input from the keyboard, output to the screen, or you can have input from a file and output to a different file. What I've done is I've said we're going to do both of those depending on the existence of the file scores.in. And let's take a look at that assignment. That'll be assignment 4. Alright, so here's assignment 4. Write the grading program, project 1, so that it will get information from a file or from the keyboard. Use data from scores.in if it is present. If you get an error opening the file, scores.in, prompt the user for the input data, ask the student name, probably should say ask for the student name. That will be a single name containing no white space, stored in a string as the first data item, so processing can continue for multiple students. So if I have a class of 12, you should be able to process all 12 of those and output the data to the output file scores.out or to the screen, either way. So if you're looking at that, it's probably going to be helpful to look back at chapter 6. There's a display, let's see, 6 dot well, there's several that involve input and output with files. Since you're going to need to determine whether this file exists or not, you can use the fail member function after you open your input file, and if it fails for any reason, probably the most likely reason would be that the file did not exist. So if that file doesn't exist, you want to take your input from the CN and send your output to Cout. If it does exist, then you also want to open your output file and send your output to that file. And that also brings us back to the output function that they've written that can output either to Cout or a file, depending on what's connected to the output stream that gets passed as a parameter, as an argument to that function. Alright, as always, if you have any questions, send me an email. If you can find me on Google+, I'll be logged in as barry.thurman@gmail.com. and I'll try to answer your questions as quickly as possible, and I will see you next time.